Cybersecurity landscape for nations are constantly shifting and evolving as new cybersecurity threats and security solutions emerge. Within the presentation, you will find current methods for authentication, authorization, and access controls, along with recommended security measures that will work against the top cyber threats. For nations to minimize their risk of a cybersecurity breach, they need to be constantly vigilant and aware of different types of cybersecurity threats they could face. However, it's important to remember there is no single one stop shop solution that can address every cyber threat your nation faces. There are too many different kinds of cyber threats out there for any one piece of technology to provide complete protection. As such, it's still important to create a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy to protect nations' most sensitive data. In the next couple slides, we will discuss authentication protocols and models. Authentication is the process in which one would verify that someone is who they say they are. The procedure is typically performed by requiring a username and password, but it can also include other methods for demonstrating identity. Such methods often include smart cards, retina scans, voice recognition, and/or fingerprints. Day-to-day examples may include displaying a driver's license at a ticket counter to board a plane. DTL Power uses authentication whenever the organization wishes to restrict the viewing of secure and confidential information. DTL Power requests clients to use web login, a form of authentication that requires a username and password when requesting to access online services. Further, within the cybersecurity risk assessment, we will explain the processes needed for improving the authentication of clients' confidential data as well as personal identifiable information. We will also explain processes employees will be required to adopt to secure such data across departments within the organization. Different types of authentication. One example is a multi-factor authentication. Uses any two or more authentication factors. A key part of this is that the authentication factors must be in at least two levels of categories. For example, using a smart card and a PIN is a multi-factor authentication since two factors are something you know and something you have. Our second option is a location-based authentication, which has been used with dial-up remote access as an additional authentication factor. One is authorized to work from home using a dial-in remote access connection to connect to work-based resources. Listed are authentication protocols used industry-wide that are helpful in identifying network users. DTL Power has proved the strength of each protocol with rigorous security analysis and have compared the computational complexity and communication costs against well-known authentication protocols. Next, we will discuss authorization protocols and schemes. Authorization is the method of finding out if a person is permitted to have a resource. The act is determined by finding if an individual is included in a particular group, if that person has admission, or if one has a level of security clearance. Day-to-day examples include checking in with a guest list to an exclusive party. DTL Power uses authorization procedures to control viewer access amongst employees. For example, DTL Power restricts the staff from certain sources of data based on security level due to the sensitivity of clients' personal information, such as social security numbers, financial history, and credit. An employee will require authorized permission granted by the parameters of the security attributes within the information system determined by department role. An authorization scheme extends the security of your application's authentication scheme. You can specify an authorization scheme for an entire application, page, or specific control such as region, item, or button. For example, you can use an authorization scheme to selectively determine which tabs, regions, or navigation bars a user sees. The main aspects of authorization are privilege, typically the application for which an individual is granted the ability to use or the duty in which they are granted the ability to perform. The role, typically a type of user such as a staff, principal investigator, administrator, or other more specific roles such as payroll coordinator. This is often dependent upon the privilege of that role and its associated with. Action, typically an action that the user can perform. Some examples are initiate, submit, approve, reconcile, or view inquiry. Lastly, span of control. This is the restriction upon the action granted to a user. This is often a restriction by an organizational code, budget number, or the organization or entity defined restriction. Now we discuss access controls and models. Access controls is a way of controlling access to a resource. Access is often granted or denied by a variety of criteria. Such criteria can depend on the network address of a client, a specific time of day, or the browser visited. Day-to-day examples include height restriction on the entrance of a roller coaster, which may or may not have to do with the attribute of a visitor. DTL power access controls are used to monitor user and employee access usage to data. The controls can define the time period activity and duration of usage of system accounts. DTL power also uses allow and deny controls for permitted controls of accounts. An example of a model will be provided in the following slide. Mandatory access controls model is within a mandatory access control parameter. This security policy is centrally controlled by a security policy administrator. Users do not have the ability to override the policy and, for example, grant access to files that will otherwise be restricted. For example, by contrast, discretionary access controls, which also govern the ability of subjects to access objects, allow users the ability to make policy decisions or assign security attributes. The MAC-enabled system allows policy administrators to implement organization-wide security policies. Under MAC, users cannot override or modify this policy, either accidentally or intentionally. This allows security administrators to define a central policy that is guaranteed to be enforced for all users. In the role-based access control data model, roles are based on several factors including authorization, responsibility, and job competency. As such, DTL power can designate whether a user is an end user, an administrator, or a specialist user. Role identifiers applied department-wide can determine access control parameters. In addition, access to computer resources can be limited to specific tasks, such as the ability to view, create, or modify files. Now we will discuss the threats, vulnerabilities, and risks found within our organization. With the recent development of technology, confidential data, and protecting that data are critical considerations for our industry. Customers want to ensure that their information is secure with us and that we keep it safe. Many of our clients that provide us with sensitive information demand that we have rigid data security infrastructure in place before doing business with them. In order to have a strong handle on data security issues that may have potentially impact our organization, it is imperative to understand the relationship and differences of three central components: threat, vulnerability, and risk, along with knowing the current environment state. What are the industry's vulnerabilities? Vulnerabilities are weaknesses or gaps in a security network or program that can be exploited by threats or attacks to gain authorized access to valuable information or an asset. In other words, it is known as an issue that allows an attack to be successful. For example, when an employee resigns and management forgets to disable the employee's access to external accounts, change logins, or remove their names from a company. This can leave the organization open to both intentional and unintentional threats. However, most vulnerabilities are exploited by non-human automated attackers. What are the industry's threats? A threat is anything that can exploit a vulnerability, intentionally or accidentally, and obtain, damage, or destroy an asset. A threat refers to incidents with the potential to harm a system, network, or organization. There are three main types of threats: natural disaster threats, such as floods or tornadoes; unintentional threats, such as an employee mistakenly accessing the incorrect information, and intentional threats. There are many examples of intentional threats, including spyware, malware, hardware companies, or the actions of disgruntled employees. In addition, worms and viruses are also categorized as threats because they could potentially cause harm to the organization and expose software to an automated attack. Risk is the potential for loss, damage, or destruction of valuable information or an asset as a result of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. Examples of risk include financial losses as a result of business disruption, loss of privacy, reputational damage, and legal implications. Security policies and measures that work against the top cyber threats one day may be rendered obsolete by new attacks to come. For DTL Power to minimize their risk of data security breaches, we need to constantly be attentive to several types of cybersecurity vulnerabilities and threats in our company's infrastructure. Outline our current vulnerabilities and threats that can cause harm to DTL Power, grouped in three categories: technology, people, and policy. Examples for technology are ransomware, which has a high impact on DTL Power. Ransomware is the top variety of malicious software found in a majority of the cases where malware was identified. These attacks place emphasis on getting encryption malware onto DTL Power's networks. Once the malware is able to enter the network, it can encrypt all the files on the network to make them inaccessible to system users. Unpatched security vulnerabilities or bugs, which is immediate impact to DTL Power. Attackers are known to target security bugs into DTL Power's software programs, bugs that often have readily available fixes. Security updates and patches are sometimes not properly applied to vulnerable software, which can leave the network exposed to outside attack and compromise. The people examples are inside man or woman, which is a high impact on DTL Power. The single biggest cyber threat to an organization is the organization's own employees. According to data cited by securitymagazine.com, employees are still falling victim to social attacks. Financial pretexts and phishing represent 98% of social incidents and 93% of all breaches investigated, which means that a majority of data breaches investigated often trace back to an employee. At DTL, some attacks are a result of employees intentionally misusing their credentials. However, many are the result of employees making simple mistakes, such as falling for phishing attempts, visiting malware-laden websites, or sharing their user credentials with someone else. Lack of employee awareness to threats, which is a medium impact to DTL. Employees who are not well trained in security measures or do not use common sense nor take active role in security are often more susceptible to these cyber attacks. Employees that remain unsuspicious to malicious activity and do not report incidents to their manager could allow harm to security networks. Policy examples are inadequate cybersecurity policy measures, which is a high impact on DTL Power. Majority of data breach incidents are the result of hacking or direct intrusion attempts made by people outside of DTL Power that are attempting to bypass network security and security personnel. Often these hacks could be prevented if employees were trained on adequate security measures for awareness and policies that were well documented. Hacking attacks often target users susceptible to being unaware. Another example includes inadequate policies for reporting lost or stolen data. With adequate policies for reporting lost or stolen data, attackers have a greater chance to cause harm to DTL's customer and/or vendors. Without the policy, employees may be unaware that they should be immediately reporting stolen devices that can be an entry point for attackers to gain access to confidential data. An attack vector is a means by which a hacker can gain access to a computer or network server in order to deliver a malicious outcome. Attack vectors enable hackers to exploit system vulnerabilities. To some extent, firewall and antivirus software can block attack vectors, but no protection method is totally attack proof. A defense method that is effective today may not remain so for so long because hackers are constantly updating attack vectors and seeking new ones in their quest to gain unauthorized access to computer and servers. Example of organizations' attack vectors are The hardware attack vector, which consists of cheat codes. Cheat codes are when an attacker programs backdoor triggers based on specific input data into hardware. A cheat code is undisclosed data that an attacker uses to identify themselves to hardware backdoor logic as a result of weaknesses in the hardware. It then sends malicious attacks within the operation mode of hardware. The code remains unique to evade being accidentally discovered during validation tests. The attacker could provide cheat codes that send single data value containing the entire code single shot, or they can send a large cheat code in multiple pieces, sequential. Hardware attack vectors aren't exclusive to state-sponsored operation. Oftentimes, criminal organizations are interested in commercialized counterfeiting products, or they wish to steal sensitive information to resell. Software attack vectors contains social engineering attacks, which are used to deceive and manipulate individuals to gain computer access. Attackers can perform this by having users click malicious links or by physically gaining access to a computer through deception. Two examples of social engineering are phishing, an attempt to access sensitive information such as password and bank information by disguising as a trusted individual, which is done via electronic communication such as emails, or farming, an attack that redirects a website's traffic to a fake website where users' information is then compromised. The motivations for social engineering attack vectors can range from espionage and competitive research to electronic crimes and data theft. They often represent a much broader and less predictable category of attacks. Con artists are the ones that can see these schemes by gaining the confidence of unsuspecting victims. They see no fixed set of rules when it comes to these attacks and often cannot be identified. Simple signature. Examples of operating system attack vectors are code injection. Code injection attack vectors entails taking advantage of those programming bugs present in the applications or operating system to carry out several types of actions. They're often sought for the collection of information, denial of service, releasing a malware, or the operating of a session against a device. Examples of code injection are SQL injection, a method of infiltration for intruder code that uses system vulnerability present in an application at the level of validation of the inputs to perform unexpected operations on the database, along with cross-site scripting, a malicious code injection attack for later execution that can be performed on websites, local applications, and even the browser itself. Usually, operate system attack vectors are placed within intentional threats since they have a human origin and also require some planning actions. The actors commonly intervening can be identified into groups such as individual small groups, hacktivists, competitors, cybercriminal groups, terrorists, and intelligence services and governments. Their motivations include financial gains such as fraud, theft, stealing, and selling personal information, disruption such as preventing other people from accessing systems, disrupting false information, and notoriety, pulling off breaches that are extremely difficult or accessing secure systems. Human factor attack vectors are not necessarily as malicious as others. However, an attack vector is the theft of property and data that are often a result of a careless user. Employees will leave their company laptop in the car only to be stolen or lose a USB drive on your way to work, both with company data on them and open to a potential data breach. As a result, company data can be taken out of the organization's networks and data can be transferred to external devices or via webmail. Motivation for human factor attack vectors are often performed by a disgruntled employee who was seeking a financial gain or a competitor within the industry seeking the company's competitive data. Finally, we will discuss risk mitigation and recommendations, policies, and best practices. Criminals target organizations for financial gain and to illustrate power. Cybercrime hasn't changed this, but has ramped up the speed and the consequences. Detailed power has focused on increasing its countermeasures. As attacks increase and regulators take closer notice, the pressure to act mounts. By recognizing that hackers will find vulnerabilities, leaders can improve the way they design and deliver services, manage risks, and train their teams. Outline is recommended security environment for DTL Power. First, you should establish coordinated protocols between power sector authorities and other agencies involved in regulating and supervising cyber risks. Next, you should volunteer information sharing cyber incidents among market participants. Regulators may develop risk and incident taxonomies and require mandatory reporting to estimate the actual or potential impact on the continuity of essential services to facilitate information strategy. Following, you should develop ICT strategy and risk management frameworks, including incident response plans with a clear chain of command to take necessary business decisions. And lastly, you should perform regular testing and simulations of incident response capabilities. However, more work is needed for protecting against cyber attacks. To maintain DTL Power's profitability, organizations must be able to respond quickly to external and internal risk events and keep their businesses efficient. Furthermore, we have to be resilient to unforeseen events. This, however, requires a deep understanding of risk and how to manage them. Outline are various risk mitigation strategies. First, you have risk avoidance or eliminating risk, which is completely avoiding the risk by eliminating its root causes. Risk reduction, suitable when risk has high probability and high impact. Risks are critical and can stop the business and may involve changing method of operation plan or redesigning the supply chain. Risk reduction, which is reducing the frequency of risk, where risk is reduced but not eliminated, suitable when risk has high probability and low impact. Operational risk and day-to-day issues align with this. Next, you have risk transfer, where risk is transferred to another party. Residual risk may still exist. This is suitable when you have a low probability and high impact. Disruption of risks such as natural disaster and terrorist attacks align with this. Common methods include insurance and contracts. Finally, you have risk acceptance, where residual risk is the same as before. This is suitable when risk has a low probability and low impact. This is when you would do cost avoiding, reducing, or transferring the risk is much higher than its expected impact. Contingency plans can be developed to handle this type of risk. DTL Power, however, is choosing to mitigate all risks through a series of recommended solutions. Next, we will discuss those solutions. We have outlined recommended solutions to mitigate technology threats and vulnerabilities. Let's first talk about ransomware recommendations. There are three things that we should align. Education of employees, where we should be educating employees about the risk of malware to prevent them from accidentally downloading ransomware. Next, you'll implement virus and malware scanning from email attachment. Use malware scanning software to identify potentially dangerous malware programs and email attachment and block users from downloading. Finally, you'll use remote data backups. Use a cloud-based data backup to recover lost data by reformatting the corrupted data storage devices and restoring them from the backup. Next, we have unpatched security vulnerabilities and bugs. This is where we'll create and maintain a rigorous patching schedule. At least once every few weeks, all software programs on the network will be checked to see whether there are any available security patches from the software developer. Any outdated software should be patched in the latest security version. If a software program is no longer supported by the developer, it may be time to uninstall that program and replace it with a newer one that does the same task. Making sure every piece of software and IT asset on DTL Power's network has the latest security patches. Now we will talk about recommended solutions to mitigate people threats and or vulnerabilities. Inside man and women recommendations. First, we will improve strategies to secure physical assets, where we'll isolate high value systems in restricted areas and apply tight access controls. We'll implement a two-factor authentication, for example, using a PIN or key card. We'll also screen new hires by performing background checks. We'll implement strong authentication protocols and deploy multi-factor authentication combining user ID password with tokens such as smart cards or fingerprint readers or on sensitive data. We'll segment LANs, and finally, we'll plug information leaks by establishing email firewalls such as CipherTrust Iron Mail and Tumbleweed Communications that can scan the full text of an outgoing email and that applies a digital signature to each protected document and blocks access based on user-generated policy. Lack of employee and awareness to threats recommendations are monitoring employee misuse by implementing web content filter tools since they can be set to block pornography, competitors' websites, and hacker tool repositories. We can also mandate employees to secure desktops. We can implement settings for each of our IE security zones to enforce the use of DTL's powers, content filtering, and internet proxy, and even forbid the use of unsigned third-party macros and MS Office apps. Finally, we'll investigate anomalous activities and deploy tools like network forensic analysis tools such as computer-associated Unit-Center Network Forensic and Sandstorm Enterprise to analyze the flow of information throughout DTL Power's network. And lastly, we'll provide security training opportunities. Lastly, are the recommended solutions to mitigate policy threats and or vulnerabilities. For inadequate cybersecurity policy measures recommendations, we will implement policy details restricting the act of disseminating confidential data. We'll implement group policies to lock down desktops across our enterprise. We'll teach effective password management. We'll include policies from a national and international standards such as NIST, access control and implementation guides, where we'll have NIST 7316, which is the assessment of access controls and systems, explains how some of the commonly used access control policies, models, and mechanisms are available for information technology systems. There's also the British Security Industry Association, which is the professional trade association for security industry in the United Kingdom. Detailed Power can also consider the developed codes of practice and technical documents outlined within the BSIA for security and access control information, destruction, physical security equipment, and security systems. Finally, there's the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is concerned with the evolution of the Internet architecture and the actions of the Internet. The IETF has dozens of working groups that each focus on a different element on the Internet, including several groups working on the Internet security. Inadequate policies for reporting lost or stolen data recommendations are implementing incident response policies. The incident response policy will be an organized approach to managing an incident and remediating the impact to DTL's power operations. The goal of this policy is to describe the process of handling an incident with respect to limiting the damage to DTL Power's business operation, customers, and reducing recovery time and cost. We will also advise employees on lost or stolen data risk. Advising employees that stolen devices can be an immediate entry point for attackers to gain access to confidential data, and that employees must immediately report lost or stolen devices. Often, the IT department can remotely wipe these devices, so early discovery can make all the difference. This concludes our cybersecurity risk assessment. Please refer to additional resource appendices for further information. Please find the attached appendices for detailed research on attack vectors, attributions, and vulnerabilities, along with the references for the cybersecurity risk assessment. Thank you.